Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Inner RAE podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about boundaries and how to shift levels of intimacy. So, in Inner RAE curriculum, we call this boundaries and invitations, and it is such an important part of navigating relationships. With that, I am Katie, and I'm so excited to be here with you all.
And I'm Erin, and this is absolutely one of my favorite things to talk about, especially now that so many more people are talking about boundaries. With that, I'll pass it back to Katie to get us started.
Ugh, I am glad to say from this part in my journey, I am also excited to talk about this topic. Had you asked me this some years ago, that would not have been the case. So many people I know and many of the clients that I coach, I've learned about boundaries the hard way. And that same tune is sung by so many different people. And I think, like Erin said, it is a beautiful thing that boundaries are now being talked about in culture today. But I also think with that comes a lot of dilution and misunderstanding of how boundaries play out in relationships and within our own internal world. To start, I want to tap into the ways in which we misunderstand boundaries by sharing an example that has recently come to the surface in pop culture. So, you may or may not have heard the buzz around Jonah Hill a few months ago. But basically, his ex-girlfriend released screenshots of text she received from him during their relationship, which just off the bat from that is a breach of a boundary. But the whole text chain that she released that I actually didn't read the whole thing around because it felt like a breach of a boundary was about the boundaries, quote unquote, he was setting with her. And I bring up this example not to go into the personal stuff of their relationship, but to explore the ways in which boundaries are being talked about. In these texts, apparently, he was bringing up ways in which his girlfriend should not be acting and things that his girlfriend should not be doing. And those were his boundaries. The issue there is that they're entirely about dictating his girlfriend's behavior and not actually about his behavior at all. So the difference of being, hey, if you're going to do this, and this isn't going to work for me, versus, hey, I know what I need for a secure attachment. I have some wounding around X, Y, and Z. And if this is not something that can be in our relationship, this isn't going to work out for me. So there's a very different way of going about how to set appropriate boundaries and how to set a container around what we need and what we want and what we expect out of our relationships. So I bring this up because it's just a beautiful coaching moment and a beautiful teaching moment. And it brought up a lot of questions that surfaced for me as I started to first dive into boundaries. So, what is a boundary? Why do we need boundaries? And what are some of the ways in which they get misused and mischaracterized? With that little picture painted, Erin, I would love for you to break this down and share how Inner RAE views this.
Absolutely. And yeah, thank you for setting that stage so beautifully, Katie. When we were talking about this topic, I knew I wanted to share that story about Jonah Hill, not because, listen, I don't think we should be digging into people's personal lives. However, I knew it was something that as listeners, you could go and look it up and really have an example of what I think so often happens in my private coaching sessions. And without having to air all of my clients' dirty laundry, I thought it would be a good direction to go. What is the boundary? And this is something that I could shout from the rooftops because this is absolutely misunderstood. A boundary is essentially where you end or begin and someone else ends or begins, right? It's a limit. An example of a boundary could be a fence line around your property. It could be how much you're willing to spend on something. So a budget is an example of a boundary. It could be how much time you're willing to spend doing something or being around someone. It could be the ways in which your morals dictate who you choose to be around, what you choose to do. And of course, being in relationship, we bump up against our boundaries. And so when we're talking about why do we even need boundaries, what's really important about boundaries, I grew up in a way where there was really a lack of boundaries. And of course, bless my parents, I think it probably was in response to maybe a culture that they had grown up in that was restrictive and maybe puritanical and overly boundaried. So there's, like we talked about a couple episodes ago, usually the pendulum swings the other way. So I grew up with the lack of boundaries. And I remember being in my late teenage years and I was traveling in another country, and I just remember being terrified to do anything. And I couldn't really understand why. And years later, unpacking that with a therapist, she explained to me when people grow up without boundaries, they don't understand safety.
Mhm.
And so they go out into the world and they don't know where they start or end. They don't know where others begin or end. And it becomes a safety issue. So if we want to know why do we need boundaries, it's a huge part of how we feel safe in the world. And on the flip side of that, that we'll get to at the end of the episode, it's how we feel love. So I've briefly explained what a boundary is, and we can dive into that more. I've talked about the basic reasons that we need boundaries. And now I want to go into how they are misused or misunderstood in our culture. And this Jonah Hill story is a great example of that. Often, what people think of as a boundary, what they're really referencing is a demand or request. And listen, it is okay to have expectations and it is okay to make requests in relationship. It's just important that you know that's what you're doing. And in our curriculum, we call that an invitation, a relational invitation. So if you're going to make an invitation or a request of someone, understand that is not the same thing as having a boundary. When you make a statement that it is a boundary, it can come across as an ultimatum. And unless you are trying to push someone out of your life or decrease intimacy, having a boundary in that way is just going to push people away and give you less intimacy. If your desire is to increase the quality of connection, get your needs met, be understood, be understanding with someone, then my recommendation is really unpack what is it that is actually the limit for yourself and what are you trying to invite the other person to do or change or be in alignment with? And is it really fair to ask that of that person? Where are your expectations? Are you just wanting them to be someone other than who they are? So these are all things to think about and the ways that boundaries are misused and mischaracterized.
Mhm. Beautiful. Yeah, and what I'm hearing as you share this that is so important is how much we have to look deeply into ourselves and into our wounds so we can understand our limits and speak to them compassionately, but also firmly. And this was a struggle for me because there were no boundaries in my life, similar to how you're explaining yours. Like there was a lot of codependence. I didn't even know what I needed or what I wanted. And so it took me a long time before I could even figure out what my boundaries were because I didn't even know there was such a thing. And I was so tuned into how another was doing that I didn't know how to tune into myself. So I just wanted to raise that. And it relates back to how we could shift the ways that we had heard the boundaries were being set in the Jonah Hill example verse, speaking to our own vulnerabilities and our own experiences and the ways in which we need to create safety for our heart to feel connection, to build capacity, and to build commitment in relationships. So I'm wondering, Erin, if you have any other examples of maybe a time when you thought you were setting a boundary when actually it wasn't?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to acknowledge that whenever you're early in the process, like what Katie was just describing, and you're aware, okay, I'm lacking boundaries. those first couple, honestly, years of trying to have boundaries, it's going to be really common to overdo it or
Mhm.
to try to set a boundary and have it come across as a demand. So while I'm sitting here criticizing maybe what Jonah Hill did, I also know that's not all of Jonah Hill's story. And if someone took a screenshot of the first couple of years I was trying to set boundaries, it would be way more humiliating. I just want to own that in what I'm going to be sharing. This is a perfect story that actually happened in my life. I was a couple years into understanding codependency, and I had these roommates, and one of them, and I should also clarify, I was in and out of an eating disorder. So specifically, this topic is going to be about bowls, which is funny in itself. But I had these cereal bowls, and in the morning, I would get up to make my breakfast, which already was a struggle for me because I was trying to just eat regularly. And my bowls would either be dirty or I wouldn't be able to find them. And so I went to one of my roommates and I was like, hey, can you please not use my bowls? And that right there is a request, which
Mhm.
totally valid request. But I did this over and over again. And I was talking to a mentor and advisor of mine at the time. And I kept saying to her, but I've set the boundary a million times. I've told him not to use my bowls, not to leave them in his room where they get caked. He would eat oatmeal and let him. And then it was like none of my bowls were ever clean. And it was a nightmare. But it was this thing. And I said to her, I don't understand. I keep setting the boundary. And she goes, honey, if the boundary is not working, it might not really be a boundary and you might need to change it. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, why don't you keep the bowls in your room? And I was like, I can do that? And honestly, when she said that, it literally had never occurred to me
Mhm.
that I could just change my behavior, which
Mhm.
is exactly what it's like to live with a boundary, right? My boundary has to do with the fact that I want my bowls to be available for me
Mhm.
when I want to have breakfast. I
Mhm.
have some trauma around eating, around food. So maybe for somebody else, having a bowl readily available is an unreasonable request. I don't know what it is. But I was living with guys, we were in our 20s, whatever. And so maybe to them, it was a silly request that didn't make sense to them. But the truth is, it had nothing to do with my roommate's behavior. Yes, my roommate was doing something that didn't honor my request, 100%. But you know what? He had his own bowls that he could use. And so by moving my bowls into my room, he understood the boundary after that.
Mhm.
He wasn't going to come into my room and take my bowls out of spite. And if he did, then I probably need to get out of that relationship and find a new place to live. But that's a perfect example of, okay, my needs aren't getting met. So I'm going to change the boundary to meet my needs rather than control this other person. As silly as that example is, it was a huge light bulb for me that I actually could get my needs met without changing the other person's behavior.
Yep. Such a good example because it really is bringing up how we have to be responsible for our own wounds, our own insecurities, our jealousy, whatever it may be. It's not up to somebody else to accommodate. If you don't feel safe or secure or seen or whatever, remove yourself and change your behavior. Don't blame it on the person. You're giving away your power that way, and you're not honoring the ways in which you need to feel safe, secure, and loved. So I love that example a lot with the bowls. And also, sorry, this is just oatmeal on bowls is one of the most aggravating things ever.
This is why we're
Put
friends
out
and I'm
there.
not friends with that person anymore, Katie. So we would live together just fine.
Okay, let's dive into maybe a couple more examples of what a boundary is and what it is not in terms of how it sounds. It's like setting a limit for how you want to be connected or committed. It's about addressing conflict with the intention of decreasing connection sometimes, spending less time or energy on a relationship. But it also has a lot to do with being able to hold your own space, right? And making sure that you are honoring your heart, your capacity, and are correctly pulling back to ensure your energy and you're not getting too depleted, right? What's an example of how you could say a boundary in a correct way, and what's an example of how it could come out in a not great way?
Yeah. And I want to be clear as I give these. Sometimes, like I said, I'm not perfect with boundaries either. So I'm going to give these examples and please just know that these are best case scenario and that in the heat of the moment, when emotions are running high, you may slip up and set a boundary in a way that's not ideal. But
Right.
this is all about really understanding the mechanics of what a boundary is so that you will organically and naturally be able to set boundaries more effectively and get the connection that you're looking for as opposed
Mhm.
to creating more discord and unnecessary conflict, right?
Before you jump in, I'm really happy that you said that because that is so important to know. When I think back to when I first started setting boundaries, had to practice a lot. And a lot of the times at the beginning, it sounded like an electric fence. And as I started to practice more and understand the mechanics of a boundary, it started to flow out more softly, more gently. And I did mess up a lot at the beginning, but I also wished so much that I had way more examples
Mhm.
of what a good boundary sounds like. So I'm excited for this part, for that part of me that didn't know what she was doing back in the day.
And listen, I've only written these out because I also didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
So, an example of a boundary, there's a couple different types, right?
Mhm.
And it's important to recognize that some of these may or may not apply to your life and your situations. One type might be if you are getting to know someone and maybe you're starting to discover that there are qualities about them that don't align with you. And maybe they reach out to you and ask you to have a one on one dinner. A good way to not push that person out completely or ignore them because maybe they have some good qualities and you have to or want to stay connected with them. You can simply redirect to a common ground. That's
Mhm.
one category of boundaries. When they say, "Hey, I would love to get dinner next week," you can say, "You know what? My schedule's a little bit full at the moment, but I'll see you at the next gathering." And you name like a mutual friend gathering that you're going to be having with that person. You're not saying to them, "I don't want to be connected with you at all," but you're just showing them that at this time, you're not giving them maybe the connection that they're looking for with you. That's an example of a boundary. Another example might be, "Yes, I'm available to do that, and I'll be leaving at 8 o'clock." Maybe somebody is saying, "Hey, will you come to this event with me?" And they really want you to come and you're feeling into your body and you're like, "Okay, I would like to go and this is my limit of what I'm available for." Now, the trick is with both of these, but specifically with that second one, I say to people all the time, just live the boundary.
Mhm.
Ask yourself, do you even need to tell that person that you're going to leave at 8 o'clock? Because early on, when you're having boundaries, and that's, I even sometimes take out the word set a boundary because that
Mhm.
implies that you have to tell the other person. Yes, it can be great to tell people to notify them because it's kind. Yes, I'm coming and I'll leave at 8. And also, maybe they don't care when you leave and you don't need to tell them. You just need to leave at 8. A lot of the mistakes that I see with boundaries is that people tell the other person because they don't trust themselves. And so
Mhm.
they're wanting somebody else or something else outside of them to hold them accountable to their boundary. And
Mhm.
yes, there is a time and place that getting accountability with boundaries can be a beautiful thing. But the truth is, at the end of the day, the only person responsible for you leaving at 8 o'clock is you. And if you put that responsibility on anyone else by naming it out loud, that is controlling, right?
Mhm.
Even if you don't fully understand what I'm saying, just trust me, it's controlling.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, nobody else is responsible for those needs inside of you.
Mhm.
Those are two examples of boundaries. Another example might be, "Hey, I really love spending time with you. And also, I'm not willing to do this activity, or I'm not willing to talk about this topic, right? Again, you can name it if it's necessary to that person. And also, if that activity starts to happen or that topic starts to come up, you can exit. And
Mhm.
if exiting would feel too abrupt for you because that's not your style, you can let the person know, hey, by the way, I mentioned to you that I didn't want to do X, or I
Mhm.
mentioned to you that I didn't want to talk about Y, right? So instead of trying to control them, you can literally just say, hey, just FYI, if this continues, I'm going to get up and leave.
Mhm.
You're just notifying them. Or you can just get up and walk away. That's always an option. It really depends on the level of intimacy you have with the other person, how much you even need to communicate.
Right.
Now, there's a difference between stepping away from something because it's in your highest good and in the highest good of the situation, and then walking away abruptly or being rude or not being relational. It could be as simple as, hey, I'm going to go to the bathroom, or hey, you know what? I'm getting tired. I'm going to head home. Those can be other ways of being kind and communicating, but not having to control the other person or making them feel bad because they want to talk about this thing or they want to do this thing that you're saying that you don't want to do. So,
Mhm.
does that all make sense?
That all makes complete sense. There's another example that's coming up for me, and this was one that I had to practice a lot in my relationships as I was shifting out of dysfunction and shifting out of relationships where there was emotional and physical abuse. Sometimes you just got to walk away in certain situations, though. I really wanted to figure out how to honor the other person and speak to it. So I had to practice this a lot. An example is I didn't enjoy our last interaction, didn't make me feel good. I would like to spend some time and space apart before we try that again. Versus, you need to change how you behave around me, or I'm going to be upset and I'm never going to talk to you again.
Mm,
Totally different things there. But in the example of the appropriate way to do that, you have to own
mhm.
how you feel and you have to own standing in that power, standing in firmly the commitment to yourself and then honoring it and not making it about what the other person is doing because you're just feeding into the spiral in the first place.
You're bringing up one of my biggest pet peeves, by the way.
Ooh,
It's
good.
not in what you said, but you're
Yeah.
reminding me of something that I hear a lot.
Mm.
You make me feel.
Yes. Oh my
Oh my
God.
gosh. That statement drives me crazy.
Mhm.
Okay. You can absolutely own that you're feeling some kind of way. That's great. That's part of vulnerability. But to then turn around and say that the other person is causing it.
Yeah.
Now, if there is a behavior or an action that has a lack of safety, or it's something that you've communicated that doesn't feel good to you, you can communicate that. But ultimately, they're not making you feel any kind of way. Your
Mm-mm.
presence, your continued presence beyond maybe your comfort level is causing you to have emotion, but ultimately it's up to you. So, in Katie's example of saying that last interaction, I was uncomfortable. And so I'd like some space. It's not, you made me uncomfortable. You're bad. You're wrong. It's, hey, that last interaction didn't work for me. And I'm actually not in a place where I even want to talk about it. I just need a
Yeah.
little time and space. Maybe we can revisit it later.
Totally. That shift is so huge because you then have to take responsibility for your part, right? It's that was so hard for me to understand. And the hardest part about honestly healing from abuse was being like, damn, I was just allowing this. And I kept blaming the other person in my head. That was the part that I really had to heal within myself. It was like, why did I stay around? Why did I stick in this? And really had to get honest with myself in the ways in which ultimately all coming back to boundaries and diving into integrity and dignity and respect. And again, that question that I heard you say that I just wanted to raise one more time is what is in the highest good for all? And how can I serve that? Any situation where there is a lack of dignity and integrity and respect is not in the highest good of either of you or the group or the community in which that's playing out.
And where I'd like to go from here, because this is
Mhm.
just the other side of the boundary, is an
Mm.
invitation.
Yes. Perfect.
Some people are like, what's an invitation? I've never heard that before. I'm not 100% sure if this would be in a psychology textbook, but this has become the word that I find that most embodies what I'm trying to articulate when I
Mhm.
say the opposite end of a boundary. When you set a boundary, when you have a boundary with a person, place, or thing, it's often in an effort to create more containment for yourself.
Mm.
What would the opposite of that be? That would be opening yourself up and allowing someone into that container of self. I call that a relational invitation. It's a relational risk where you invite someone in for a deeper form of intimacy than you're currently having with them in that moment.
Mhm.
Examples of what that might look like are, let's say Katie and we've had coffee a couple times and we've been having a lot of fun. And I say, "Hey, Katie, I would love for you to come over to this dinner party and meet some of my friends." That's a relational risk. In that moment, Katie could be like, "Whoa, that is not what I thought was happening here. I don't want to meet your friends. You're crazy." Probably not going to happen because I'm intuitive. And also, I'm obviously using Katie as an example to be silly. But when you are vulnerable and you open yourself up to somebody without expectation, that is an invitation. And what's really important about that, that I see so often where this gets misused, is a lot of times what people are doing when they're giving an invitation is they're attempting to change or control the other person.
Mhm.
And that is not the highest vibration of an invitation, right? So in relationships, what I see a lot is maybe in a marriage, a wife or a husband is not feeling as connected to the other person. An invitation might be like, "Hey, honey, why don't we go on a date?" Or an invitation might be, "Hey, I'd really love for us to try couples therapy."
Mhm.
Now, the other person may not want to do the thing that it is that you're asking them to do. It's still important to take that relational risk and invite them in more deeply. And then, whatever feelings you have on their response, if you're feeling rejection, maybe you're feeling joy because they say yes, but whatever you're feeling, you're responsible for taking care of those emotions and those feelings because that, I'm just here to tell you, being in a relationship involves risk. It
Mhm.
involves vulnerability. It involves inviting people in unsure of what they're going to say because humans are unpredictable. And that's just part of life. It's really important when we take that risk and give someone an invitation to connect more deeply that we don't punish, that we don't lash out based on their response, because then people don't feel safe to have boundaries. They don't feel safe to receive an invitation from you. And that's going to ultimately decrease intimacy in the long run.
Absolutely. And just one more example, because I loved examples. So I think the more we throw in there, the better for people listening. If we take the example that I just gave before of the boundary, how you would flip that into an invitation if it's a safe person you can go into. Okay, because I value our connection, I'd really like to discuss the uncomfortable situation from the other day. It wouldn't be, hey, we need to talk about how you spoke to me the other day if you want to be in my life, right? Slight difference there, and it depends on the capacity commitment in the relationship if you can do that, but it's important to raise the difference between how phrasing really shifts a boundary
One
for
of my favorites, which is in our anatomy of relationship workshop, the attachment
Mhm,
workshop, is the example of a good invitation. Let's say you're dating someone new
mhm,
and you're like, "Hey, I'm loving getting to know you. I would love for you to meet this person that's important to me." That's an example of an invitation.
mhm,
The not invitation version of that is, "Hey, you haven't made time to meet my best friend, so you must not care about me at all."
mhm,
That's not relational. That is what I would say is a very emotionally immature way to say the same thing,
mhm,
right? Because at the core of that is a little kid who's, "I want you to be friends with my friends," right?
mhm,
It's a very normal, natural feeling to have,
totally,
but what part of you are you gonna elicit to communicate that to this person that you're getting to know?
totally. Is there anything else that is coming to your mind, Erin, that you think is important to share on this topic?
Yeah, one other piece I'd like to talk about as we start to bring this episode to a close is the concept of, when I first started learning boundaries, it was all about protection. It was
Mhm,
all about safety, right? And if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, makes perfect sense. When you have complex PTSD, when you struggle in relationships, early boundary setting is going to feel like I'm protecting myself. And to me, that's when we went back to why do we need boundaries? It's to feel safe. It's to have protection. If you don't have shelter, if you don't know what is yours and what is someone else's, it's really hard for you to have a calm nervous system and feel safe. What I love about this topic of boundaries and invitations is that as you go up in the hierarchy of needs, as you have that sense of safety, boundaries can then be applied from a place of what's most loving. Instead of how can I protect myself, it's like, how can I exhibit self love? And how can I love this person by doing what's in the highest good of the situation? If you are somebody who's new to boundaries, just know that it's okay for them to feel protective. But as you grow and evolve and you start to get used to them, the next step in the evolution is to start to shift and ask yourself, what's in the highest good? What is most loving to myself? And what is most loving to this other person?
Mhm. Totally. I think that's so important to raise. I'm glad that you brought that up. As I hear all of this, I imagine my inner child running around and just speaking to her in a way that she feels safe and secure with the boundaries and the commitments that are set, and how important it is to have them because it creates security. It creates stability in your life and it gives you an idea of what is right and what is wrong, and it gives you freedom, and it helps you establish the difference between security and freedom. There's a way of being this mama bear, that bringing that mama bear energy into it, and I had to do a lot of reparenting when I started figuring out boundaries, because the ways that I was told to set them didn't really feel authentic to me. So I had to work with my inner child of like, what do you need here? How can I communicate this in a way that feels safe, that feels secure, that feels like it's honoring me and the other person and the capacity in the relationship?
I love that so much. I just had this image of anytime I'm going to be setting a boundary moving forward, of imagining Air Bear is sitting
Mhm.
there listening, being mindful of the language that I use, of the behaviors. It's like, how can you set a boundary or have a boundary or live a boundary in a way that is kind and loving and respectful
Yeah.
for all? Now, of course, there are going to be situations that are toxic, that are harmful, where having a boundary is going to need to be more extreme. That's why we have no contact on the intimacy spectrum.
Mhm.
Like, it is absolutely okay to be more severe where there is a lack of safety.
Mhm.
But for the most part, and honestly, if my inner child was there, I would want her to see me take a lack of safety very seriously. So,
Mhm.
for the most part, imagining that your inner child, or maybe a niece or a nephew or a child of your own, is sitting there with you, would you say and do the things that you're saying and doing if they were listening? Because
Yeah.
that could be a good barometer for you of, is the way that I am using boundary and an invitation effective and helpful? Because
Mhm.
there is an inner child inside of you always listening, and you may actually have children around you listening and watching you and learning from you, because children learn almost all of their relational behaviors in their subconscious by the time they're 5 years old. Just remembering that those parts of you are always listening and there may be actual children around you. And I think parenting in general is where a lot of people have to confront and understand boundaries really well, because it obviously comes up in parenting a lot. So, with that, Katie, I would love to hear from you today. Who is someone in the public eye broadcasting their inner, radiant, authentic energy, inspiring you to live in your most inner, radiant, authentic self?
Person that is coming to mind, and it's related to this last example we just gave around children, is her name's Dr. Becky Kennedy, and she is a parenting expert. I've been following her for a really long time, and she gives so many good examples of how to set healthy boundaries. And it all comes back to the yes from self love and also the no for protection and safety, and the discernment between those two things. And knowing that your number one job as a parent is to keep your kids safe. And if something is happening that is unsafe, there does need to be a firm no. And sometimes there isn't a full redirection of that energy. It's just, we cannot go there. This is absolutely not safe. I'm going to remove you from the situation. I'm not going to leave you alone in this, but I'm going to go with you into the other room and we can sit in this feeling together. You're not alone, but we can't be there anymore. It is unsafe. And then also really getting into this idea too of what you were saying all throughout the episode of a boundary on the flip side is an invitation into something else. And so she does a really good job at giving examples of that redirection of energy and how to blend the boundary with the invitation when you're dealing with a child and also when you're dealing with it within yourself. I would highly suggest checking her out and just seeing how the language she uses resonates with you because it has really helped me find my voice and has helped me express my truth and express what I need in relationships. Check her out.
I love it. And I think that's a great general tip. Obviously, going and following this woman will be really helpful to our listeners, but also finding some parenting books or some
Mhm.
parenting accounts on social media to follow, even if you're not a parent. Because the truth is that if you're on this healing journey, which I imagine you are if you're listening, there is a lot of reparenting within yourself, within your inner parts that goes on. So, parenting resources can be really helpful, even to those of us that are not parents.
Mm.
As we close, I also want to give a shout out to our course, which is called Anatomy of Relationship, a guide to mastering attachment. It is on our website. And this is a course that we're always going to have available. I go into depth about the intimacy spectrum, what makes up a relationship. And there's some intro about boundaries and invitations. I would say in the future, there'll probably be an in depth course just on boundaries and invitations. So be on the lookout for that. But definitely go to our website to check that out if some of the stuff we've been talking about today is helpful to you. So, with that, I guess this is the end of this week's episode. Do you have anything you want to add, Katie?
Nope. Thanks for listening, everybody.
All right. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.